Hu Tao, one of the most universally beloved Genshin characters ever. For the longest time, she was heralded as being one of the strongest DPSs in the entire game. Yet, as the days go on, it feels as if our silly funeral director is falling further and further into irrelevancy. Why is that? So today, I thought it'd be fun to analyze Hu Tao's fall from meta grace, looking into aspects of both her meta history and current status to determine whether she has truly fallen off or not. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. First off, I think it's important for me to paint a picture of just how powerful Hu Tao was in the meta back in the day. Like, she dominated it. Back when she came out, she sorta popped out of nowhere unexpectedly, yet it didn't take long for people to recognize her as a member of the Liyue Big Three. She was easily one of the strongest DPS units at the time. The Abyss was a lot less boss-centric too, with a healthy balance between AoE and single-target battles included. So you were able to justify getting Hu Tao for her incredible single-target abilities, as most 5-stars that came out before her were primarily AoE focused. She specialized in something that hadn't necessarily been covered yet. She did come with her flaws, of course, namely the debate surrounding how her C1 made the character feel so much better to play. There was no Xian Yun back then to fix clunk issues. Jump cancelling was unfortunately a must at C0. Staff of Homa was also a pretty big deal for her damage output, but I'ma be real, Chief. I feel like Dragon's Bane was always severely underrated on her. At R5, it was never that much worse than Homa. Anyways, the debacle over her C1 would remain as a dark cloud over discussions surrounding Hu Tao for pretty much her entire meta career. Yet in my opinion, there was always a really easy justification for getting her regardless of such things. There simply wasn't a better limited 5-star pyro DPS. Even if you were stuck down at C0 R0 with her, she was pretty much your best bet no matter what. If you fast forward to the Inazuma era of Genshin, sure, there was Yoimiya, but when the Fireworks Girl released, she came out with her own slew of issues, including a somewhat buggy kit that only got ironed out over months worth of updates and patches. She was also pretty much never as good as Hu Tao, with her only leverage over the funeral director being her smooth ease of use, which, to be fair, was a big selling point for a lot of people who didn't want to pull for C1 Hu Tao. Many folks, and rightfully so, did not want to pull for a constellation that was simply selling the solution. Even so, a properly jump-cancelled Hu Tao still cooked Yoimiya by a good margin, so she remained on her lofty meta throne throughout all of the 2.x era. In fact, things only got better for her because she received a massive buff of Yelan now being in the picture. You could play what was at the time, the cutting-edge team of Tao, Shengqiu, Yelan, and typically Zhongli from one of the strongest teams at the time. Oh, how times have changed. Yelan also opened some other doors for the funeral director, such as Funirational, which allowed you to force some AoE into Hu Tao teams. While this may seem like nonsense nowadays, back then, because she was one of the strongest DPS characters, it made sense to try force her into more situations like this. It was also a good way to simply deal more overall team damage. Coming from somebody who actually played the team quite a lot back then, it felt really strong. It was always one of the fastest clearing teams on my account, but I didn't use it much since I needed Shangling for Child on the other half. Talking about these teams makes me feel like a fossil, man. Both Shengqiu and Yelan being in the same team allowed them to cover for each other's weaknesses, while applying enough Hydro for Hu Tao to vape every single hit without fail. Damage bonus percent was also a much scarcer resource back when we didn't have our beloved Lady Farina in the picture. Very dark times indeed. So Yelan's ramping damage bonus passive was priceless in value to the team. Throughout the Sumeru era of Genshin, she didn't receive any major updates to her teams or weapons. She gained Staff of the Scarlet Sands, which was an amazing alternative choice for her, but it didn't gain its true value until Fontaine, which we'll touch on a little later. Was she still really powerful in the meta, in spite of not receiving any major updates thanks to the rise of the Dendro meta? Yep. While new teams with really decent damage ceilings were coming out, ones that were very strong considering how cheap they were to run honestly, the fact that Hu Tao was the best limited 5-star pyro DPS still remained. Her single target was also still top tier. Nobody in Sumeru could really challenge the wild prowess that she held over boss-centric content. There was a slight resurgence in AoE abysses during the 3.x era, most likely due to reactions such as Bloom, yet there would, without fail, always be a second half that would be more focused on single target-centric content. Those were the realms in which Hu Tao thrived. Then we move on to Fontaine. Competition, at long last. Hu Tao had been literally uncontested ever since 1.3 when it came to her role. The closest possible contest she ever had was Yoimiya, who had greater comfort but definitely not greater damage. Fontaine finally introduced some competition into the absolutely monopolized field of single-target pyro DPSs. It started with Linny. Before Farina came out, he kind of went over everyone's radar, including mine. I actually believed that Hu Tao was better for a few patches, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. The funny thing is, Linny was better than her even pre-vape. Before I continue talking, Linny's playstyle is a nuker with minimal charged attacks for stacking purposes. He does not play like Ganyu. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, he finally offered competent competition when it came to the single-target pyro character niche. He was fine right out of the box at C0 while raising the pyro damage ceiling by a pretty shocking amount. However, if you were a non-believer before Farina, well, holy guacamole, Vape Linny is truly something else. His ownership rate is shown to be really low on most reliable sites. Being 2.5% more than Siegeween is not really anything to brag about, so I don't blame people for not knowing about how strong Vape Linny is, or for not knowing that his actual playstyle is vape nuking. Arlecchino does a little more damage than Vape Linny, so we literally had father tier numbers before father. So Hu Tao had been power crept the moment that Linny came out, yet then got completely and utterly decimated by him once Lady Farina came out to buff him once again. It's actually hilarious how good this unit is, dude. A lot more people have Hu Tao as opposed to Linny, so I can understand if you don't believe me, but I seriously urge you to look at Vape Linny runs. They are hilarious. I mentioned the Magician's dad earlier, so let's talk about Arlecchino, who cooked both of them. She does way more damage than Hu Tao while having a much easier playstyle, simple normal attack spam, and no animation cancelling nonsense required. And while it's C0R1, it's not like her damage is astronomically higher than Linny's. She is certainly far more adaptable and does not need as much player skill to access the full extent of her power. She has teams for pretty much every situation ever, while still having Vape as her strongest good old reliable. Plus, while Linny and his dad might be pretty close in power level when looking at C0R1 investment, the higher that you move up the constellation totem pole, the more ridiculously powerful that Arlecchino becomes. She's got the strongest C6 in the game, meanwhile Hu Tao has one of the most underwhelming constellation lineups ever. C1 is huge for her, then the rest of her cons kinda just exist, I guess. The main areas where the funeral director had no contest had suddenly been challenged by some absurdly strong individuals. Best single target pyro DPS? Well, might I introduce you to the almighty Magician's King. The best limited 5-star pyro DPS option in the game? Well, might I introduce you to none other than Father Arlecchino. The DPS ceiling rose massively too. It's not only those two who sort of fried Hu Tao. Nuvolette, Navia, Coriander. I also think that if you gave Rio Beastly his C1 and R1, he'd be able to compete with a C1 R1 Tao's vape teams. That's not to say Fontaine ruined everything for Hu Tao though. Remember earlier when I said that Sino's weapon would get its time to shine in Fontaine? Well, it's arguably better for Tao and healer teams where she isn't going below 50% HP because she can take full advantage of the passive. You won't be taking full advantage of Homa anymore. Plus, Xian Yun made C0 Tao feel so much more playable. Yes, Xilunen is technically more worth playing, but the real question is whether you're willing to actually put up with all that jump cancelling in a day and age where we have pyro options who don't need to do such things. Lady Farina was also a wild buff to Tao teams, but that's more so because our beloved Hydro Archon was a buff to all double Hydro Core users in the game. Also, more damage bonus percent is always a lovely treat. It doesn't help that the recent release of Xilunen has allowed Nuvolette to become just as strong as the best single target DPSs in single target scenarios. Before, they would beat him against bosses, meanwhile the Hydro Dragon dominated AoE. But now, yeah, that's not the case. So pretty much all hype around what Hu Tao was capable of dissipated, as the unique qualities she held were stolen from her. She had an absolute monopoly over the pyro DPS market, until Fontaine decided to go, nah, at Powercreep. Even now, we're getting stronger and stronger single target options. Mualani in particular has been doing some really funky shenanigans in the speedrunning scene. I think the most interesting thing to me is that people didn't really recognize that Hu Tao had fallen off until Arlecchino released, despite Linny already being 10 times better than her on his release. Arla is a far more popular character, I suppose, but Hu Tao fell off the moment that Linny was thrown into the picture, but I suppose she didn't lose relevance for most people until Arla came out, because a majority of people don't own the Magician's King. Now, I don't think Hu Tao is bad. She's still a solid pyre DPS, all things considered. But I suppose if we go by the loose definition of having fallen off, which is you're at a lower point than you were before, then yes, she has indeed fallen off. There isn't much reason to get her over a linear Arla in particular, or any of her Fontaine/Natlan DPS for the record. The only member of a Liyue Big 3 who actually survived was Xiao. The other two have sort of faded away. She's at least in a better position than Ganyu, much better in fact, and all things considered, she's still a super solid damage dealer. Sure, she's been kicked out of S tier, but that doesn't suddenly mean her damage is completely irredeemably bad. These new DPSs also have super convenient ease of use right out of the box at C0, which can make having to pull for an extra copy of a character in order to make them feel equally as smooth quite the tall ask. It was justified before when the upgrade resulted in you having a literal S tier unit, but nowadays not so much. I think it's fine that she's been taken down a notch though. She's the kind of unit where I think she is still worth using if you have her, but I wouldn't go out of your way for her now. She had a total monopoly over the limited 5-star pyro DPS market for nearly 3 years. That's more than enough time for natural power creep to take place. And it's not like she got hit as badly as most of her really old characters in terms of power creep. She still gets buffs every now and then to keep her relevant. After all, she is one of the most popular characters in Genshin Impact, so it only makes sense that she is kept somewhat relevant. Xiaolunen was a super neat buff, for instance. With that being said, what do you think about Hu Tao's current meta position? Do you agree with me when I say that she's fallen off a bit? Do you think it's even worse than that? Or perhaps do you disagree with the thought that she's still very much a high-ranking DPS? Let me know down below in the comments. Hopefully this video was able to tell you about whether Hu Tao has truly fallen off or not. This has been Juice, signing out, and Hu Tao isn't even the one who's gotten the worst of it. You know who's seriously cooked? Yoimiya!